Hello, everyone. Whether you're watching this live or later on YouTube or Patreon, I appreciate you taking the time. Couple quick things: 31 stories for Halloween on my Patreon page starts October 1st. One story every day, all the way through the month of October. Once we get into November, I'm going to do NaNoWriMo Live, and that will be the first 50,000 words of a novel. I've already picked out the novel that I'm going to write. I kind of have some ideas going in my head, have no notes yet, so I'll definitely be looking at that at least by October 31st at the latest. In each of my sessions of writing on that novel, I'll record, so pretty much every day in November up until about 50,000 words. And if I'm successful, sometime before the end of November, we will have the first 50,000 words of a novel. Whether that's the whole novel or not, I'm not sure yet. The story I'm going to do today is actually going to be part of 31 horrors for the holidays, which will be basically the same thing as stories for Halloween, only during December. So every day in December on my Patreon, there'll be a new story each day, and this is one of those that I'm editing now to have on there. And of course, you're getting to see it for free if you're watching it here. This story was halfway. It originally appeared in the Actuator Borderlands anthology, edited by James Wymore. It was the Actuator was sort of his universe. He invited some authors into this anthology to sort of play in his playground, and I had a lot of fun with it. It's been a long time since I've looked at that story, so I don't actually remember exactly what all happened in the story. I'm hoping it's good. I seem to remember enjoying writing it, so I'm hoping that works out. Before we do that, I want to promote somebody else's stuff. I have no connection to this other than I am a fan. Fellow streamer, Kaiju Poet. You can find him at twitch.tv/Kaiju Poet. Kaijupoet. Kaiju meaning strange beasts or big monsters. Sort of the Godzilla tradition, but it goes broader than that. Fall of the Kaiju is going to be a full day of Kaiju-themed horror games and interviews on October 15th. That's 2020. It runs from 12 a.m. to 12 a.m. I believe that's going to be Central Time. But again, if you're doing 24 hours, just jump in anytime during the day. Two things are coming out that day. Devour the Earth anthology, which will be a bunch of those types of monster stories. And then a novel by Lucas Mangum. If you look in my stream here, or if you look on YouTube, depending on where you're watching this, you'll find the episode of the podcast where I interviewed Lucas Mangum specifically about this book, and we go in depth because I actually read it and we talk about it together. So you get to see Kaiju games streamed, you get to see book giveaways, live readings, interviews, and more. So Kaiju Poet is going to be putting that on. That's actually John Baltusberger, who heads up Madness Heart Press, and that's who those books are coming out through. Great streamer, great guy, great publisher, great poet, and he's putting on a really good event, so I plan on dropping in periodically throughout the day for that. Let's go ahead and jump in on the story we're going to be looking at today. Again, this is Halfway by J. Wilburn. Travis, you need to wake up. Lying in bed isn't going to make this go away any faster. You need to come on to group. Travis Fuller was awake, but he kept his eyes closed. He had the familiar sweats and headache. The nausea was worse than last time he tried to quit. He wouldn't even have been in the Redemption House in Bucksnort, Tennessee, except that he almost got busted, and admitting himself was his only option to get the local cops off his back. Bucksnort, Tennessee is actually a town. It's very small. Basically, if you were driving along the highway across Tennessee on your way to Memphis, you will pass through it. It's a gas station. There's like a porn shop, and I think there may be one hotel. I'm not sure. I don't remember exactly. But it seemed like I always ended up stopping at that exit to go to the bathroom whenever I was going to visit family in Memphis, and I always kind of wondered about this strange little town. When you pull it up on Google Earth, there's really not much there. There's a few houses out and about and some of the roads, but it's basically empty space. So I was always fascinated with this town, and even wrote a couple stories kind of set in my imaginary version of this town. I guess this would be one of them. To his credit, he was making a real go at not using while inside this time. Travis knew it had more to do with being in the middle of nowhere with no contacts, but he was still following the program. The counselor shook Travis's shoulder, and Travis held his stomach. He opened his mouth to snap something out to make the man stop. He paused, as he could not remember if the guy's name was Mark or Mac. It was in that instant that Travis's withdrawal and nausea became something else entirely. He felt his skin crackle, and in his mind he pictured himself peeling like an orange. He would have thought he was high, but he was as clean and dry as he had been in months, probably longer. Travis smelled burnt hair, which made him think that he might be stroking out. Then he smelled a dozen kinds of pie, scented candles, the rich stink of the marshes back home, and the smell of fresh cut wood. Travis groaned. Something's wrong. His voice echoed back at him and repeated in different notes like a sound played through a synthesizer. Mark or Max screamed, and his voice warbled through the ranges of sound too. Travis saw thousands of colors waver behind his eyelids. When he opened his eyes, he saw light dazzling around the sides of his bunk. He heard more screams on both sides, but they had dropped back to normal ranges of human terror. Travis sat up and rolled out of the bed, staggering toward Mark or Mac on the west end of the house. He stepped out of the wall of light and into a bizarre wash of overly bright color. Colored scarves wrapped around the counselor's throat and dragged him backward along the floor between the beds. The glass shattered from the windows, and cartoonish clowns climbed through the opening, carrying umbrellas and balancing beach balls. One fat clown climbed up onto a unicycle. He waved his arms in exaggerated circles and fell forward. His big body and striped suit landed square on Mark or Mac, crushing him. The counselor's blood splattered up the walls. A bit of gore struck Travis in the face, and he jolted. The blood seemed too bright, like raspberry jam. The fat clown laughed in a forced yuck-yuck sound. Travis shook. This isn't happening. A tall, skinny clown with a green mohawk and a nose ring as big as a door knocker picked up another resident Travis knew as Big D. The punk clown popped open a giant top hat and stuffed Big D inside, head first. Is head first one word? Let's see here. It is, in fact. So we fix that. As his bones crackled and his body bent, D screamed. The fat yuck-yuck clown in the pool of raspberry red on the floor reached up and honked his own nose as he stared at Travis. Another skinny clown in a dress and tutu stepped over the fat clown and left bloody footprints as she approached Travis, carrying a rope of tied scarves and swaying her hips. She smiled her oversized red lips in her grease paint white face. Her voice came shrill and sharp. "I'm going to spin you like a top." The other clowns laughed hard enough to hurt Travis's ears. Other residents screamed as more clowns poured through the window and seized them. Travis backed away and tripped over the end of his bunk. He stumbled and fell backwards through the wall of light. Through his fear of the clowns, he felt the wash of sensations. As he fell, he saw every color and tasted 100 competing flavors. He crawled and scooted back until he emerged from the wall in the east side of the Redemption House. Still backing away along the floor, he stared at the clowns through the filter of the light barrier. The female clown touched the wall and backed away from the crackle of energy on her side. He heard the clowns laugh at her, muffled through the wall of light. Travis stopped and looked down at his hands and around the rest of the bunk room. Where the clown world was overcolored, the east end of the building had no color. Travis and every other object were in flat black and white like an old movie. He stood and turned in a full circle. "I'm dreaming." The fat clown and female clown in the other world turned away and attended to the screaming residents trapped on that side. Travis spotted a black and white nurse standing in the middle of a room looking down at her hands. Instead of wearing her usual blue scrubs, she wore a retro dress with a white apron and bonnet with a gray cross on it. Noticing his own clothes, he still wore the jeans and sneakers he had fallen asleep in, along with the concert shirt for a band that hadn't existed back when movies were in black and white. Except for being colorless, he looked normal. The nurse screamed, "What's happening? Is this real? What happened to my clothes?" A man stumbled through the barrier into the colorless world. His scream went from muffled to piercing. He held his stomach as he passed Travis. The nurse tried to stop him, but he collapsed at her feet. As his hands dropped away from his belly, confetti exploded out of the wound in a black cloud of paper. A set of fake pale flowers popped up out of his stomach. The nurse wiped gray blood off her hands onto her apron. The muffled cackle of clowns passed through the barrier behind him, and he shivered. "I have to get out of here." The nurse looked at Travis after he spoke and back down at the body. She didn't answer. Feeling his pockets, Travis spotted his bedside table in the psychopunk circus world on the shock-colored side of the barrier. He shook his head. "Just leave them alone. Just leave them and go." The nurse called behind him, "Are you talking to me? Travis, what's going on here? What's causing this?" "I was hoping it was a dream or I was high," he said, "but I couldn't make this stuff up during my worst fix." Travis gritted his teeth and dove over the bed. Passing through the barrier as he slid across the sheets, the super surge of everything passed through his senses. Through the overload of information, he detected the smell of cut grass and the taste of pickled beets. Both reminded him of home, which made him sad and afraid at the same time. Travis's head and upper body emerged in the hyper-technicolor side of rehab. More raspberry jam painted the room and ran down the walls. He pulled the drawer, shaking the bedside table and banging the wall as it stuck. The clowns turned and faced the noise. Travis groaned and pulled harder. The drawer came free and rattled the contents inside. He fished his hand through and felt several items, including his keys and wallet. The clowns reached for him. Taking the bundle of envelopes in the rubber band, he left the rest. The roof of the building peeled back, raining shingles and broken wood into the room. A tower of clowns sat on one another's shoulder in an impossible formation. Holding up the roof, the sky appeared striped like the inside of a big top. The white-gloved fingers of the clowns on the floor grabbed at Travis. He rolled back through the barrier and fell on his butt in the black and white wing of the building. He turned away from the clowns' leering faces on the other side. Travis lifted the bundle of unopened letters addressed to him, with the return address from home in Ravenstitch, South Carolina, and his brother Blake's name in the corner. He stuffed the letters in the back pocket of his gray jeans. The nurse said, "Why did you do that, Travis? You could have been killed by those psycho circus clowns." Travis turned to face her. A tentacle snaked out of the hallway behind her in the air. He pointed and yelled, "Look out behind you, a thing!" The tentacle wrapped around her face before she could scream. Her bonnet fell next to the body on the floor with the gray cross up. She clawed at the suction cups on the tentacle as the powerful arm lifted her and pulled her backward down the hallway in the air. Travis cursed. Another tentacle smashed through the paneling of the wall behind him, and he screamed. He dropped to his stomach on the floor as the arm whipped back and forth in the air. He considered crawling back through the barrier and trying his luck with the clowns again. From under his bed and through the shimmer, the fat clown rested on his stomach, waving back at Travis. Beyond the sinister clown eyeing Travis from under the bed, other clowns on the backs of elephants used the broken pieces of the Redemption House to create bleachers out in the field. People in chains were hustled up into the seats for whatever show was about to begin. Travis whispered, I guess you didn't kill everyone." The clown under the bed held up one finger and beckoned him forward without a twitch from the red, smiling lips. Travis crawled under the other beds along the wall as the tentacle smashed through other furniture in the room. He stayed on his belly as he moved onto the tile and crawled through reception. Once he reached the door, he heard more glass shatter behind him. Travis took a deep breath and stood. He ran through the door out into the bright, colorless world. Something roared behind him, but he kept running east toward the cover of trees, away from the black and white B-movie tentacle monster, away from the barrier that fell across his bunk, and away from the circus punk psycho world. Travis ran away from the Redemption House, sliced in two down the middle of the town of Bucksnort in the middle of Tennessee. As he ran between the trees in the black and white world of eastern Tennessee, Travis kept repeating, "This can't be real, this can't be real, this can't be real." He kept saying it as he heaved for air, but he kept running too. Eventually he collapsed at the edge of a field of cows overlooking Highway 40. It wasn't until that moment, gasping for air, staring at the black and gray cows, that Travis realized he was running toward home, and that's where he wanted to go. Ravenstitch was in the marshes near the Atlantic coast. Travis realized that was hundreds of miles, and across mountains too. He wondered if the new insanity of the world stretched that far, or if he might find some other nightmare circus pitched its tent between central Tennessee and the Carolina coast. Oh, I wonder if there is anyone left in the stitch that still wants to see me. The cows gave no answer as they chewed the gray grass like nothing had changed. Travis narrowed his eyes. "Do you guys only see in black and white already? Maybe the world hasn't changed at all. We are just seeing with cows' eyes. Well, I guess that and a tentacle monster and the punk clowns with their raspberry jam." He felt his insides lurch. As he spewed up a gray swill in the grass next to him, Travis clutched his stomach. He groaned and then heaved again. Rolling to his back away from his sick, his body racked with pain and sweaty chills, his withdrawal crept back into the new reality. He closed his eyes on the gray sky and the white-hot sun beyond the black leaves above him. "I've been a clown for a while, and my world has been colorless for as long as I can remember. This is just a new twist on an old theme." A rumble rose from the dirt, and the ground shook. Trees crackled, and something roared in the distance. Travis opened his eyes and rolled to his stomach. The cows ran, but Travis could not see from what they were fleeing. Deciding not to wait, he ran too. He stood across the street from the bright gray neon. Classic cars pulled into the slots, and girls on roller skates brought trays of fries and milkshakes. Each car seemed to have a guy in a black leather jacket and a girl with big hair and a fuzzy gray sweater. Travis had to tilt his head to read through the glare of the colorless light. He read out loud, "Joe's Malt Hop." Travis crossed Highway 40 and stood on the curb, away from the action and the music, that seemed to repeat the same riffs without ever getting to the lyrics. Down the road toward the east, darkness grew. This isn't the same road. The highway was only 2 lanes and had no signs. He was pretty sure that Joe's Malt Hop had not been there before he went into the Redemption House, before the east half of Tennessee lost its color and West Tennessee unleashed the clowns. Travis thought there might have been a Crazy Joe's fireworks. He felt his stomach heave again, and Travis bent over, taking deep breaths. Car doors slammed, and Travis heard whistling and shouting before he raised his head. The toughs, with their slicked back hair, circled around 2 blond boys in leather jackets, waving knives at each other. The girls stood around the outside of the circle of the boys. They had their hands together in front of their faces and bounced with excitement. The waitress continued to deliver trays to the empty cars, hanging them on the doors. Travis eyed one dark gray car with the top down near the street and the driver's door open. 2 milkshakes and a cheeseburger balanced on the tray over the open door. Something ran out over the cheese from under the bun, but without color Travis couldn't tell if it was ketchup or something else. Aside from the black and white, the food looked like a prop from a photo shoot. In all his days short order cooking at the Tasty Stop back in Ravenstitch, he had never made a burger that looked that good. Maybe if I had, I'd still be there instead of trying to get back there through whatever nightmare this is. The threats and slashes intensified between the 2 toughs in the parking lot as the crowd undulated around them, cheering. They still had not managed to draw any gray blood. Travis heard Travis heard sirens in the distance down the unmarked two-lane version of Highway 40. He took a step back from the open car door and looked up the street in both directions. He wondered if the gray-toned cops knew about his meth use and sales. The metal-on-metal screech that vibrated. Okay. A metal-on-metal screech vibrated the ground. Don't need that in there. Giant ants crawled over the building with the washed-out light from the sign shining on their bellies. Sparks flew as bulbs exploded under their segmented legs. The crowd screamed and scattered around the parking lot. The first ant leaned down and pierced one girl through her sweater on both sides of her body with its massive pincers. Gray blood flew out in the parking lot in large globs as she fell limp in the ant's grip. Travis jumped in the driver's seat and slammed the door. One of the milkshakes flipped and poured cold down the front of his shirt. He gasped as he shifted in reverse and pulled away from the slot. A boy in a leather jacket dove across the tray and grabbed the steering wheel. The cheeseburger fell in Travis's lap, and the second milkshake dumped down between the door and the seat. With the top down, wind blew through the back of Travis's hair as he backed into the street, away from the ants tearing into the other cars. The boy threw an elbow into the bridge of Travis's nose. "Get out of my car, mister." Okay, why is all that done? Interesting. Alright. Select all. Let's colorize that, uncolorize it. Select all. No color. Alright. I pulled this from some old edits, so I guess some of the highlighted stuff was still in there. Travis pushed the kid's face up with one hand and turned the wheel. Alright, let me roll that down. I'm sorry. Travis pushed the kid's face up with one hand and turned the wheel with the other. The car's headlights flashed east down the highway as the ants crossed the bloody parking lot, screaming with their metal-on-metal screeches. The tray snapped loose from the door and the boy fell on the street beside the car. Travis shifted the gear arm on the steering column to drive and stomped the gas to the floor. The back wheels spun dust up in the air and squealed against the street. As Travis fishtailed up the road, the engine roared. The boy stood and ran after the car, falling behind in Travis's view in the side mirror. Other kids ran across the road with their hands in the air. The ants growled and smashed through the building. One charged up the highway behind Travis. He kept his foot on the gas and outpaced the B-movie monster. Travis looked for a button to raise the top on the car, but didn't find one. Lights flashed through the windshield, and Travis looked up as headlights in both lanes. Domes on top of the double line of police cars flashed as they laid down on their horns with the additional blare of the sirens. Swerving off the road into the grass to avoid the accident, dirt and sod tore into the air from under his wheels, with the lines of police cars whizzing by on the highway. As he heard gunfire and screeching behind him, Travis lost count of the passing squad cars. Veering back onto the road, he raced up the street away from the monster movie, toward where his home should be. He felt around behind him but couldn't locate a seatbelt. Travis picked up the cheeseburger he discovered in his lap. After taking a bite, he held the steering wheel with one hand and wiped his mouth on his arm as he squinted. The road was difficult to see without color. Everything blended into the black, like a fuzzy grain on a night scene of an old film, and Travis couldn't focus on the edges of the road. "You don't miss something until it's gone," he said. Around the bite of gray beef and bun. "We'll see how much Blake and my mom miss me once they see me again." Travis made a face and spat the partial chewed bite out over the door. He gagged and spit again. Looking at the drab burger in his hand, he threw the whole thing out into the street without slowing down. Jesus, he raked his tongue over his teeth. Cardboard tastes better than that. God, I cooked better than that when I was high. Rubbing at the wet smear down the front of his shirt, he picked up a black cherry and stared at it in his pale gray hand. He decided not to try it and tossed it over his shoulder into the back seat. Glancing down, he spotted the unspilled milkshake wedged between the seat and the door. He sighed and pulled it free. Travis held it up in the wind of the moving topless car. He stared at the smear of whipped cream and the thick gray concoction. Curiosity got the better of him, and he took a sip. Travis held it in his mouth a moment and shook his head. He spit it back into the heavy glass and tossed the whole thing out into the street. In the mirror he saw it splatter, but the glass didn't break as it bounced along behind him. "Where is the flavor in the world?" he shouted out at the darkness. "How did life get colorless and tasteless? What happened to the world? Wake me up." Travis thought about the clowns and the barrier again. He looked in the rearview mirror and swallowed on the lifeless aftertaste stuck in his throat. A pterodactyl soared above the road, with something in its claws. Travis looked forward in the black and white spill of the headlights over the street, and he pressed down on the gas. "I need to take a leak, but I'll wait." Travis shook with hunger and the gut-twisting pain of withdrawals. He had driven until he had to pull off the road and close his eyes. After peeing in the woods, he tried to pull up the top on the car, but it felt like a solid piece, as if the car were just a prop and not actually a fully functioning vehicle. He had to close his eyes. The sound of scratching woke him up. He didn't wait to see if it was from the side of the car or off in the woods. Travis started the engine and roared away with his head down. Daylight drifted into the dark again as he continued to drive. Travis tried to calculate miles and time, as well as how long he might have slept, but none of the numbers lined up. The road wasn't right, and although he did drive through mountains, they did not align with the world he knew. The mountains looked like a flat, matte painting, and the black and white valleys were sick with gargantuan creatures terrorizing town after town. Travis couldn't find any road signs or state lines. He passed no gas stations, and the fuel gauge stayed just below full no matter how far or fast he seemed to go. With his luck, he imagined it was stuck and he would find himself stranded at any moment. He swerved around a gorilla and a spaceman helmet in the road. The car threw sparks as it grazed along the guardrail. Then a giant tarantula, as large as a car, raised its arms above the drop-off and crawled up into Travis's lane. He swerved again and kept driving. The mountains dropped away and Travis continued along the endless two-lane blacktop. His head dropped as he dozed, and he whipped it back up with his eyes wide, trying to stay awake. "I'm not stopping. I'm lucky to not be dead from the last time I slept. I need to find a hotel or an empty house." He thought about the monsters burning houses in the valleys with rays from their eyes, and he shook his head. A hotel in a B-movie world is probably not a good idea either. Where the hell am I? He didn't see the next barrier until the crackle tore through the front of the engine block and the car punched through. I said through twice. Punched out. But Travis felt the impact as if he had crashed through something solid. His first sensation was realizing the car was turning fire engine red in front of him. Then the wall of energy swallowed him. The shock brought him wide awake, and the overload of sensation jarred his mind in the fraction of a second it took him to pass through the barrier. Every region of his tongue sizzled on every taste bud. He particularly noticed the flavors of aspirin and greasy fried chicken. He smelled everything, but focused on the odors of fresh baked bread and unwashed clothes. Travis saw every color, which was particularly shocking after growing used to the muted... I'm going to change this from black and white to monochrome. From the muted monochrome of the B-movie world. One shade of gold reminded him of the curtains in his parents' house before his father split when Travis and Blake were still kids, and before the fire. It was still dark on the east side of the barrier as the bright red car roared through, but he saw green in the leaves within the headlights and the yellow lines on the road and off the reflectors. The engine sputtered and lost power. Travis pumped brakes but felt resistance. The headlights dulled and the fuel gauge dropped to empty. He tried to turn the wheel but got no response. He could not feel his fingers as he opened and closed his hands on the steering column. The car bounced on the curb and bounded down the slope. The passenger side ground against the dark tree trunks. The mirror ripped off that side and one headlight exploded into darkness. He saw scissors where his hands should have been and could not look away. Something crunched under the car, and the red, let's say vehicle instead of car, since we already said car. The red vehicle shuddered to a halt just shy of wrapping around another tree. His head jerked forward toward the points of the scissors on the ends of his hands. Travis pulled up just shy of impaling himself on his scissor fingers. He sighed. That was close. No seatbelt, and I'm betting no airbags either. He felt thread pulling at his lips, and he leaned out into the mirror. The loose thread was sewn around his lips like something wanted to discourage him from talking. He screamed, but his tongue pressed against the thread, and he stopped. Travis swallowed and leaned down toward his hands around the steering wheel. He snipped carefully and spit the ends of thread out of his mouth. "I'm going back," he hissed. Travis unwound his hands from the steering wheel and clawed at the door with the sheer sound of metal. The sound reminded him of the ants. The handle to his door wouldn't respond, so Travis climbed over and fell to sitting with his back against the driver's door of the strange red car. He groaned as his hands caught at the top of the door before pulling free. Travis flexed two bladed fingers on each hand and watched the blood well up red along the connections on his wrists. He closed his scissors fists and held them out away from the sides of his body. Lights flickered as they moved in a line through the trees. He took to his feet slowly and climbed back to the side of the pavement and a curb that seemed too high for a road through the woods. Travis took a few steps and stopped under a black iron post with green tarnish up its scalloped surface. A solid metal sign hung from chains on the post's arms at the top. It declared Raven Stitch. Travis stared and shook his head. It can't be that easy. He looked down at his bladed hands and spit out more thread from his lips. He turned and looked back at the shimmering wall of energy across the road and the black and white world beyond it, stretching across an alternate version of the Carolinas as far as central Tennessee and Bucksnort. A giant black and white frog with vampire fangs hopped into the road and sat as if it were waiting for Travis to return. Travis looked down at his hands and up at the deadly frog. He considered both options for a long moment. After the gray monsters is the punk circus and the killer clowns and God knows what else beyond that, Travis said. I guess it wasn't that easy all told. He turned and looked under the sign. The lights crossed the road beyond the next bend in the direction of his hometown. In whatever condition this side of the new barrier had left it, that place represented the reason for everything he faced in this journey. Should spell that correctly while we're here. Now he wasn't sure. He wanted to see what might come next. What world has taken over the coastal marshes of the Atlantic? Travis pictured sea monsters crawling up on the beaches and attacking the resort hotels. He shivered, but he walked forward. As he drew closer, a small bell rang and rattled. I don't want to see this. He rounded the bend and stopped with one foot on the street and one on the raised curb. He could see the hollow shell of the tasty stop. The diner he used to cook in looked reconstructed using giant playing cards. A column of men with staves took wide steps as they passed through the pieces of the clapboard buildings. They walked to the tangled woods beyond. "Hey, can I get some help here?" Travis waved one metal hand. One of the men turned, showing button eyes and stitched mouth over a cloth face. He turned from Travis and ran away from the road. Travis looked at his scissors and back in the direction of the men. At first, as he walked, Travis focused on the scrambled geography of his hometown. Nothing was like it was when he fled his family and friends. He quickly shifted his focus to the strange anatomy of the men passing through the town without quite sticking to the roads. Their bodies bulged in the middle and were pitted with squares of stretched, weaved cloth. Travis assumed they were bodysuits, but they had no openings for breathing beyond the weave of the cotton or polyester material. Some of the bodysuits had zippers up the back, while others had oversized zippers in the front. A few had buttons, and most had buttons for eyes in different colors and sizes. All the mouths were stitched lines across the bottom of the hoods. A few had bells or stars hanging from the heads of their staves, but most had lanterns. Something roared and crashed on Travis's side of the road. The suited men turned to look and scattered into the trees. One cloth man with goggles sewn over his eyes and a lantern on his stave stopped and faced Travis. A pair of giant metal scissors rose into view, levitating over the forest. It snapped through the trees, dropping the top portions. It snapped through the trunks, dropping the top portions of the trees. "What's going on now?" The scissors paused and turned their point toward Travis's voice. Something growled, but he couldn't see the source. The cloth man ran across the road toward Travis. Travis held up his hands and ran toward the scissors. Held up his hands and ran toward the scissors, away from the suited man charging him. The material man tackled Travis and clapped his hand over Travis's mouth. The material of the fingerless mitten felt soft and reminded Travis of his mother's sock monkey collection, but the grip was firm. He could still draw air through the glove material, which is how he assumed the men in the bizarre suits kept from dying. Travis tried to raise his hands, but the points of his scissors had stabbed into the ground. He noticed he still wore his concert shirt and jeans, which struck him as odd in that moment. Travis mumbled through the hand between worlds. The giant scissors resumed snipping trees, and a branch fell on the ground near Travis's head. The material man reached down with his other mitten and turned the key on his lantern and staff. The light snuffed out, and the metal snips passed by overhead above the road like an aircraft. The cut trees fell across the road. One forked treetop crashed through the tasty shop, scattering debris. The man held his glove over Travis's mouth as the scissors cut deeper into the woods away from them. Travis pulled one scissored hand free from the dirt and pushed against the material man's belly with his arm. He felt no resistance from the body inside, as if the entire man consisted of nothing except tightly packed stuffing. Travis slid out from under the hand of the ragdoll man. Travis regained his feet and backed away. "I don't want any trouble, sock monkey man." The man looked down and picked up the bundle of envelopes bound by a rubber band. He gripped them in both mittens and held them close to his goggles. Travis felt his empty back pocket poking him. Why would his pocket be poking him? Let's just say he felt his empty back pocket. He charged forward. Let's make that he instead of Travis. He charged forward. "Those are mine." The man stood and held them out. Travis paused and then took them between the blades. He snapped the rubber band and sliced into the envelopes. Travis opened his hand and scattered them out on the ground to keep from destroying them. The material man gathered them together and tucked them under his arm. Travis swallowed and said, "Thank you." The man nodded, but his stitched mouth stayed in a static line. He lifted his staff and keyed his lantern back on, lighting the ground between them. The man waved Travis toward him and pointed up the street. He looked up the roadway and back at Travis, still pointing. Travis looked down at the letters under the man's arm. The ragdoll man turned and walked up the road a few steps. He turned back and waved to Travis to follow. Travis stared with the snip and crash of trees in the distance. The man turned his back on Travis and continued up the road. Travis thought about the clown under the bed, behind another barrier, beckoning him with one gloved finger. Alright, let's stop saying Travis all the time. I think I didn't want to confuse who I was talking about, but it's getting a little redundant. He swallowed and followed behind the sock man. "Do you know the Fullers? They lived on Shaw Road. Did they survive what happened here?" The man's soft shoulders twitched up at Travis's voice, but he did not answer or turn. He continued walking, and Travis continued to follow. Alright, let's just say he. Too many Travises. He looked off into the trees, watching for the scissors or something worse. He saw smokestacks in the distance puffing out jagged streams of black cloud. The smoke hung in the air and looked suspiciously like cotton or flax darkened with dye. He saw a taller, skinnier ragman plowing a field behind a stuffed donkey. The fence was formed by planks, rounded at the ends like large popsicle sticks. As they passed, the puffy man Travis followed and the skinny farmer waved at one another. Travis saw straw poking out of the farmer's clothes and realized his head was formed from a carved jack-o'-lantern with a lit candle inside. Travis swallowed. The puffy man pointed back at the sky over the woods behind him. The farmer nodded his jack-o'-lantern head, causing the candle's flame to waver. The man continued forward and Travis followed. Travis cleared his throat. "I'm looking for my brother Blake Fuller and my mother." The loud snipping sounded again. The material man ducked down by the fence and Travis knelt beside him. The shadow of the shears passed over them but continued on across the landscape. After a moment, Travis whispered, "Are we safe?" The sock man looked at Travis and pointed up at the tarnished iron post. Travis looked up and saw the metal sign on the chains for Shaw. He stood back in the road. Travis started to run and the man grabbed him. Travis started to run. Let's make that but, because we changed what's happening. Travis started to run, but the man grabbed him and halted him. He held out his lantern and stared up Shaw Road. Walking behind the man, Travis followed. Let's say the man walked and Travis followed, because whatever else I wrote did not make sense. Okay. Only one house stood at the end of the road that looked nothing like the street Travis remembered. The man opened the crooked gate and let Travis through. They walked up a cobbled path toward a cottage with crooked corners and uneven lines. The door sat intact, but the house split down the middle, a cross-section with furniture showing in a kitchen and living room like a child's dollhouse, partially opened on a hinge. Travis stopped shy of the porch. The sock man slid his staff into a slot by the door, casting light into the house. "This isn't the house I left," Travis said. "Do you know where my brother and mother are? The house wasn't broken when I left." The man nodded his cloth head and walked up the steps. He opened the door despite the split through the center. Another sock person stepped out into the doorway and looked outside. This one had white yarn hair and pink button eyes. She wore a flowered apron around her waist. The new sock person dropped to her knees and held out her arms at Travis. Travis shook his head and took a step back. "This isn't happening. I'm sick.
I haven't eaten in days and I'm dreaming all of this. I'm hallucinating. I should have never tried to quit again. This is what sobriety has gotten me. God help me. Travis brought his hand to his face and sliced his cheek. He hissed and moved his hands away. The cloth man reached inside the door and Travis took another step back. He extended his mittened hand with an oversized envelope in it. From a distance, Travis could read B. Fuller in the corner and T. Fuller in the center. The transformed envelope did not have an address, but like the other envelopes in Travis's pocket, the new letter was unopened. I couldn't open them, Travis said. If they stayed sealed, they were still whole. I would never know if you were asking me back, forgiving me, or telling me never to hurt you two again. If I didn't open them, I still had all the possibilities. The man set the envelope back down inside the house and held out both arms like the woman on her knees. Travis bowed his head and his lips quivered. I wish I had never started. If I hadn't destroyed everything, I would have still been here, and we would have gone through this whole thing as a complete family. I always left you two to deal with everything without me, just like Dad. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I waited too long. A soft hand on his shoulder pulled him forward. Travis walked up the steps into the house. The Sock family hugged him tightly and pushed the air out of him. The woman with the yarn hair guided Travis to a chair by a table near the split in the dollhouse. She clattered around the kitchen and set a plastic plate out in front of him with a yarn chicken on it. It actually smelled so much like fried chicken that Travis was tempted to try to eat it. I don't think I can eat this. The sock man that Travis assumed was his brother Blake sat down at one of the other chairs and pushed the yarn chicken closer to Travis. Travis sighed. It's not that, big brother sock monkey. I'm not made of the same stuff as you. I need people food like what we ate before the world changed. Do you remember the world changing? Are you too aware of what has happened to you? The sock Blake just stared. The woman lifted Travis's hand by the wrist and opened the scissors, exposing the cut. Travis saw his brother's material shoulders stiffen. She reached up and felt Travis's cheek, coming away with blood on her mitten. Travis laughed and patted the cloth woman's other mitten carefully with his scissors. It's not as bad as it looks, Sock Mom. I'll be okay. She reached back up and pulled the last few strands of thread from his lips. Then she let go of his hands and walked away. Travis looked at the dark sky out of the opening in the house. He thought about walking back through the western barrier and finding some of the cardboard-flavored food. Even if he missed the flying scissors and the B-movie monsters, he wasn't certain the food possessed any nutrients. He thought about searching out the coast a few miles away. If the geography had not shifted too much, he might be able to fish, or he might find another barrier and a world that was normal out on the water. He had seen a farmer with a pumpkin head, so maybe there was food growing he could eat, if it wasn't all being used for someone's head. If there is nothing I can eat, I might have to leave again and go north or south to find somewhere I can live. The sock man reached out and patted Travis's shoulder. The woman sat down across from the two very different boys and took Travis's hands. His mother closed the blades carefully and slid a mitten over the top of the scissors. Travis laughed and stared as she pulled another over his other set of blades. I think I could still poke someone, but thank you. She opened her other mitten and produced a needle and thread. She reached for his face. Travis started to pull his head away, but his sock man brother grabbed his shoulders and held him in place. Travis gritted his teeth, but stopped fighting. The woman looked at the needle with one pink button eye. She threaded the needle and tied off the end of the thread. She leaned in and pressed into the point of Travis's cheek. He shook and groaned. She sewed through both sides of the cut and pulled. I don't need to say through. And pulled the full length of the thread through his flesh. Travis hissed and she stabbed through his cut again. He said with a grunt, "I guess I earned a little bit of pain." He closed his eyes and gripped his knees with his free covered hand as his cloth family stitched his wound. Travis didn't think about anything else for a while. After a moment, Blake patted Travis's shoulder. Travis reached up with his mitten and felt the tight stitch on his cheek. He still felt the scissors underneath the material covering them. Blake motioned for Travis to follow him to the door. His mother hugged him hard once again, and Travis followed his brother out on the path. Blake stared up at the sky and back and forth across it, let's say. We don't need to say sky twice. Back and forth across it. "Are you sending me away, Blake?" Blake pointed up at one of the branches on a tree in the side yard. Travis saw large purple bulbs of fruit that he couldn't identify, but he knew wasn't yarn. Travis stared for a moment before pulling one of the mittens off his scissors. He snipped off a branch and held it cradled in his arms. Travis smiled at his brother and speared one of the pieces of fruit on the blade of his scissors. Blake nodded his material head, and Travis took a bite of the fruit. He savored the taste as the juice ran down his chin. Blake reached out and rubbed the dribble away. Travis nodded and Blake looked back at the sky. Travis swallowed and glanced up. "Do the big scissors come by often? Do we need to go back inside?" Blake shrugged but kept looking up. "I'm glad to not be your biggest problem for a little while at least." Travis and Blake sat down beside their house in silence as Travis ate. We're doing too many Travises again. He couldn't read his brother completely, but he thought he was happy to have Travis home. As he took another bite, Travis's bladed fingers on his other hand twitched. After a light snip sound, the bag covering his sharp hands opened enough for him to see 2 points. Blake stared up at the sky and did not seem to notice. With a sigh, Travis chewed up the pulp he held in his mouth. A sting behind his eyes and a quiver in his jaw kept him from taking another bite. He swallowed several times to keep from sobbing or sniffing. As his brother stared at the sky and he stared at the ground, Travis realized that he had become something different than his family when he passed through the last barrier. His mother tried to cover it up, as she always did, and his brother ignored it or tolerated it, but the sharp danger was still there. It was a part of him. He thought briefly about talking his family into going through the B-movie world. They could face the dangers together in human form, but he knew the difference and sharp danger would still be there. Travis was the herder, like his father, with scissors where his hands should be, and a history of causing pain before leaving. He knew in that moment he would leave at some point. He wondered what barriers lay north or south if he followed the coast. He shuddered. A shudder traveled through him, but he still thought about it. He took a deep breath and another bite of fruit on the end of his bladed finger as he sat with his cloth brother a little while longer. Alright, that is halfway. So I think it's pretty good. It probably could use another pass or two. There's a couple things I skipped over that I need to go back and look at. But that'll be up for 31 Horrors for the holidays in December.